Jack Rodriguez never thought he'd find peace in a place like Willowbrook Estates. After 23 years in the Navy with the last 14 as a SEAL, he was used to chaos. Desert storms, midnight raids, impossible missions that kept him awake for days. But here, in this quiet neighborhood with its perfectly trimmed lawns and white picket fences, he finally felt like he could breathe. His wife Lisa had picked out their house while he was on his final deployment. She'd sent him photos through encrypted messages, her excitement jumping off the screen even through the grainy satellite internet. "Look at this kitchen," she'd written. "And there's a perfect spot for a garden in the front yard." Lisa worked as a nurse at the local children's hospital, pulling 12-hour shifts that left her exhausted but fulfilled. The garden was going to be her way to unwind, she said. A place where she could grow something beautiful after spending her days helping sick kids get better. Their daughter Katie was 7 when they moved in, all pigtails and endless energy. She'd been born while Jack was stationed overseas, and he'd missed more of her early years than he cared to count. Now finally home for good, he was determined to make up for lost time. Katie had already claimed the big oak tree in their backyard as her personal fortress, and Jack had promised to build her a proper treehouse once they got settled. The neighborhood seemed perfect for a family trying to start over. Tree-lined streets where kids rode bikes without fear, neighbors who waved from their driveways and actually meant it. The kind of place where people still brought casseroles to new families and remembered each other's names. Jack had grown up in a rough part of Detroit, where looking the wrong way could start a fight. This felt like stepping into a different world entirely. Moving day had been chaos, but the good kind. Lisa directed traffic while Jack and Katie unpacked boxes. Their next-door neighbor, an older gentleman named Frank, had wandered over with a cooler full of cold drinks and stories about the neighborhood. "Been here 30 years, Frank said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Best decision my wife and I ever made. Good people here. Real community spirit," Jack appreciated that. "In the teams you learned to rely on the people around you. Your life depended on it. Civilian life felt strange without that automatic trust, but this neighborhood seemed different." When Katie's soccer ball went over the fence, it came back with a smile. When Lisa's car wouldn't start one morning, 3 neighbors offered jumper cables before she could even ask. The house itself needed work, but Jack found he enjoyed it. After years of living out of duffel bags in temporary quarters, having a place that was truly theirs felt like a luxury. He spent weekends fixing loose boards on the deck and painting Katie's room the exact shade of purple she'd picked out from 17 different samples. Lisa laughed at his precision, but Jack couldn't help himself. When you'd spent years where attention to detail meant the difference between mission success and disaster, old habits died hard. Lisa's garden became her obsession almost immediately. She spent hours researching what would grow best in their climate, sketching layouts on graph paper, and visiting every nursery within a 20-mile radius. "I want tomatoes," she told Jack one evening, spread out on the living room floor with seed catalogs scattered around her. "And maybe some peppers. Oh, and definitely herbs. Katie loves helping in the kitchen, and fresh basil makes everything better." Jack watched his wife plan her garden with the same intensity he'd once used to study mission briefings. It made him smile. Lisa had given up so much during his Navy career, moving whenever the service demanded it, raising Katie mostly alone during his deployments. If she wanted to grow the world's most elaborate vegetable garden, he'd help her build raised beds that would last forever. The Homeowners Association had seemed like a good thing at first. Jack appreciated organization and clear rules. During his initial walkthrough of the neighborhood, the property manager had mentioned that the HOA kept property values stable and maintained community standards. "Nothing too strict," she'd assured him. "Just basic stuff to keep the neighborhood looking nice." Jack had read through the HOA documents before they bought the house. Standard stuff mostly. No cars on blocks and driveways. No painting your house neon green. Keep your grass cut and your fence in good repair. The kind of rules that made sense for people who wanted to protect their investment and maintain a pleasant place to live. What he hadn't expected was how seriously some people took their volunteer positions. At the first community meeting they attended, Jack watched in amazement as the board president, a man named Robert Kane, conducted the proceedings like he was running a Fortune 500 company. Every agenda item was scrutinized, every expense debated as if they were allocating military budgets instead of deciding whether to replace the playground mulch. Kane owned a local construction company and had been HOA president for 6 years running. He spoke with the authority of someone used to being obeyed, though his kingdom was only 300 suburban homes. Beside him sat Patricia Manning, a retired school principal whose idea of community standards seemed to involve measuring grass height with an actual ruler. The third board member, Dale Watson, nodded along to everything Kane said like he was afraid to have his own opinion. Still, Jack didn't see any immediate problems. The meeting covered routine business: snow removal contracts, landscaping bids, and a lengthy discussion about whether the community pool needed new umbrellas. Boring stuff, but necessary. Lisa squeezed his hand during a particularly tedious debate about sprinkler schedules. And he knew she was thinking the same thing. They could live with boring if it meant stability for Katie. After the meeting, several neighbors introduced themselves. Most seemed like normal people trying to balance work, family, and the simple goal of enjoying their homes. A few parents mentioned that Katie would love the local soccer league, and someone else recommended the best pizza place in town. These were conversations Jack could handle, a far cry from the coded communications and life-or-death decisions that had defined his previous career. That first month in Willowbrook Estates felt like exhaling after holding his breath for decades. Jack would wake up each morning without checking for threats or planning escape routes. He'd drink coffee on his back porch watching Katie play in the yard while Lisa tended her growing garden. Normal problems like a leaky faucet or scheduling Katie's dentist appointment felt manageable after years of impossible missions in impossible places. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent his career fighting to protect the American way of life, and now he was finally getting to live it. White picket fences and neighborhood barbecues, little league games and parent-teacher conferences. The kind of peaceful existence that he'd defended in abstract terms was now his daily reality. Jack had no way of knowing that this peace was temporary, or that the very organization meant to protect their slice of the American dream would soon become their biggest threat. For now, he was simply a husband and father trying to build a normal life, completely unaware that his wife's innocent garden would soon paint a target on their entire family. The letter appeared on a Thursday morning, tucked neatly under their front door knocker like some kind of official document. Lisa almost missed it as she rushed to get Katie ready for school and herself ready for another long shift at the hospital. The white envelope with Willowbrook Estates HOA printed in stern black letters across the top looked important enough to pause for. "What's that, Mommy?" Katie asked, backpack slung over one shoulder, lunchbox dangling from her hand. "Just grown-up mail, sweetheart," Lisa said, though something about the envelope made her stomach tighten. She'd been getting the normal HOA newsletters for months now, but those came in the regular mail with colorful headers and community event announcements. This felt different. After dropping Katie at school, Lisa sat in her car in the hospital parking lot and opened the letter. The words hit her like cold water. Notice of violation. Property address 247 Maple Street. Her hands shook slightly as she read further. Unauthorized landscaping modifications in violation of Community Standards Section 4.2. Immediate remediation required. Lisa read the letter 3 times, each pass making less sense than the last. Section 4.2? She'd read those documents front to back before planting a single seed. There had been no restrictions on front yard gardens, only requirements that landscaping be maintained in good condition and appropriate to the neighborhood character. Her tomatoes and herbs were healthy, well organized, and bordered by neat wooden frames Jack had built. They looked better than half the front yards on their street. During her lunch break, Lisa called the HOA office. The receptionist, who sounded barely old enough to drive, put her on hold for 10 minutes before transferring her to Patricia Manning's voicemail. Lisa left a detailed message explaining her confusion and requesting clarification about which specific rule her garden violated. Manning called back 2 days later during Lisa's shift. The conversation lasted exactly 3 minutes and left Lisa more frustrated than before. "The board has updated community standards," Manning explained in the tone she'd probably used on difficult students for 30 years. "Vegetable gardens in front yards are no longer acceptable. They detract from the aesthetic uniformity we're trying to maintain." "When were these standards updated?" Lisa asked, trying to keep her voice professional. "I never received notice of any changes." "The board has the authority to modify standards as needed for community welfare," Manning replied stiffly. You have 30 days to remove the non-compliant landscaping or face additional penalties. Can I see these updated standards? I'd like to understand exactly what's required. They're being finalized. You'll receive them when they're ready for distribution. The line went dead. Lisa stared at her phone, feeling like she'd just been dismissed by a middle school principal rather than someone elected to serve her neighborhood. She thought about Jack, currently away at a training conference for his new civilian job. He'd been so proud of the raised beds he'd built, measuring and cutting every board with military precision. Katie had helped plant the seeds, her small hands carefully placing each tomato start in its designated spot. That evening, Lisa walked through her garden with fresh eyes, trying to see what the HOA board found so offensive. The plants were healthy and green, growing exactly as they should. The wooden borders were straight and painted to match their house trim. Everything was neat, organized, and attractive. She'd received compliments from passing neighbors, and Mrs. Chen from 2 streets over had asked for growing tips for her own vegetable plot. The second letter arrived the following Monday, this time with a bold red stamp. Second notice. The fine was $200, with an additional $50 per week until the violation was corrected. The language had grown more aggressive too, mentioning legal action and property liens if she failed to comply immediately. Lisa felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd dealt with difficult hospital administrators and demanding parents during her nursing career, but this felt different. Personal. Like someone had decided to make her life complicated for reasons she couldn't understand. At work, Lisa found herself distracted during her shifts. While checking on patients or administering medications, her mind kept drifting to that threatening letter sitting on her kitchen counter. She'd worked too hard to build this life with Jack and Katie. The house represented stability after years of military moves and uncertainty. The garden was her small piece of beauty and a job that often showed her the worst of what could happen to children. She tried reasoning with the situation. Maybe there was some genuine concern she wasn't seeing. Maybe other neighbors had complained, though she couldn't imagine why. Her vegetables weren't blocking anyone's view or creating any kind of disturbance. If anything, they added color and life to a street where most front yards were just grass and foundation plantings. The third letter arrived on a Thursday 2 weeks later. This one came certified mail requiring her signature. The fine had increased to $500 and the language was unmistakably threatening. Failure to comply will result in legal proceedings to enforce compliance, including the potential for property liens and additional legal fees. Lisa's hands trembled as she signed for the letter. Her neighbor Frank happened to be checking his own mail and noticed her distress. "Everything all right, Lisa?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. "HOA trouble," she said, holding up the envelope like evidence of a crime. "They want me to remove my garden." Frank's expression darkened. "That garden? It's beautiful. My wife walks by it every morning and always mentions how nice it looks. Apparently it violates some new standards that I've never seen, and they won't show me." Frank shook his head slowly. "This board's been getting more aggressive lately. They hit the Johnsons with violations for their mailbox being the wrong shade of black. 3 different families on Oak Street got fines for inappropriate holiday decorations last Christmas. Normal stuff that's been there for years. What did people do about it? Most just paid the fines and made the changes. Fighting it costs more than complying, and these folks know it." Frank looked at the certified mail envelope in Lisa's hands. "But I've never seen them go after someone's vegetable garden before. That feels personal." That night, Lisa called Jack. She'd been hoping to handle the situation herself, not wanting to burden him while he was trying to establish himself in his new civilian career. But the threatening tone of the latest letter had crossed a line. "They want you to remove your garden?" Jack's voice carried that edge she recognized from his military days. Not anger exactly, but the focused intensity that meant he was shifting into tactical mode. "They say it violates community standards. But they won't show me these standards or explain exactly what's wrong with it. And they're threatening liens against our house? $500 so far, with more fees every week until I comply." Jack was quiet for a long moment, and Lisa could almost hear the gears turning. "I'll be home tomorrow evening. Don't respond to any more letters until we can look at this together. Jack, I don't want to make this into some kind of war. Maybe I should just replant with flowers or something." "Lisa." His voice was gentle but firm. "You read the HOA documents before you planted. You followed their rules. How they're changing those rules without notice and demanding you pay for their changes. This isn't about your garden anymore. After Jack hung up, Lisa sat in her kitchen looking out at the plants she'd nurtured from seeds. Tomatoes were starting to form on the vines. The herbs were flourishing, and Katie had been so excited to help harvest them for dinner. The idea of ripping it all out to satisfy some bureaucratic power trip made her feel sick. She thought about the other violations Frank had mentioned. Mailbox colors and holiday decorations, normal people trying to enjoy their homes, getting hassled by neighbors who'd appointed themselves as judges of what was acceptable. It felt like being back in high school, where the popular kids made arbitrary rules about who belonged and who didn't. Lisa had never been one to back down from a fight when something mattered. She'd stood up to doctors who dismissed her observations about patients. She'd advocated for families when hospital policies seemed cruel or unfair. But this felt different because it was happening in her own home, the place that was supposed to be safe. Tomorrow Jack would be home, and she knew he'd want to fight this properly. Part of her was relieved to have his support, but another part worried about what happens when someone with his background decides that a line has been crossed. Jack had spent years dealing with people who used intimidation and bureaucracy as weapons. He knew how to respond to threats, but those responses weren't always proportional to suburban neighborhood disputes. As she turned off the kitchen lights and headed upstairs, Lisa looked once more at her garden through the window. In the moonlight, the plants looked peaceful and innocent, just vegetables growing in neat rows like gardens had done for thousands of years. Tomorrow, this simple act of growing food for her family might become the center of a conflict she'd never wanted or expected. She had no idea that her HOA troubles were just beginning, or that the people targeting her garden had no intention of stopping until they'd made an example of her family. Jack arrived home Friday evening to find Lisa sitting at their kitchen table surrounded by papers, looking like she'd been preparing for battle. 3 certified letters lay spread out in chronological order, along with printouts of the original HOA documents and photos she'd taken of their garden from every possible angle. "They're escalating," she said without looking up. Another letter came today. "The fines are up to $800 now, and they're talking about emergency enforcement actions." Jack picked up the latest letter, his jaw tightening as he read the increasingly hostile language. The letterhead still said, Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, but the tone read like legal threats from a debt collection agency. "Have you seen these updated standards they keep mentioning?" "That's the thing," Lisa said, pulling out a thick folder. "I've called 6 times asking for them. I've sent emails. I even went to the HOA office in person. They keep saying the standards are being finalized, but won't give me any specifics about what my garden violates." Jack sat down across from her, his mind automatically shifting into the analytical mode that had served him well in the teams. So they're demanding compliance with rules they won't show you, for violations they won't specify, with penalties that keep increasing. Exactly. And when I try to ask questions, Patricia Manning treats me like I'm a child who's being deliberately difficult. What about the other board members? Robert Kane won't take my calls. His secretary says he's too busy with important community matters. Dale Watson just refers everything back to Manning. Lisa pulled out another paper. But I did some research. Guess what Robert Kane's construction company specializes in? Jack looked at the printed web page Lisa had found. Kane Construction advertised high-end landscaping and hardscaping solutions for discerning homeowners. Before Jack could comment, Lisa continued. And Patricia Manning's daughter owns a landscaping design business. They're on the HOA's approved vendor list. You think they're drumming up business? I think they've figured out how to use their positions to create problems they can then charge people to solve. Jack felt that familiar focus settling over him, the same clarity that came before a mission briefing. What else have you found? Lisa had been busy. Over the past week, she'd started connecting with other neighbors who'd received violation notices. The pattern was disturbing. Young families, elderly residents living alone, anyone who seemed unlikely to fight back effectively. Meanwhile, board members and their friends seemed immune to the same standards. Look at this, Lisa said, showing him photos on her phone. Robert Kane has a front yard that's literally just rocks and cactus. Patricia Manning has pink flamingo decorations that have been there for 3 years, but somehow my vegetables are the community eyesore. Jack studied the photos, his tactical mind mapping out the larger picture. This wasn't about community standards or property values. This was about power and money, with his family caught in the crosshairs because they'd had the audacity to grow tomatoes without permission. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Saturday morning, while Jack was inside making coffee and Lisa was watering her plants, 3 vehicles pulled up to their house. Jack heard car doors slamming and looked out to see Robert Kane approaching their front door with Patricia Manning and 2 other people he didn't recognize. By the time Jack reached the front yard, the situation was already escalating. Kane was standing uncomfortably close to Lisa, speaking in the loud, aggressive tone of someone used to intimidating people into compliance. "This is your final warning, Mrs. Rodriguez. The board has been more than patient, but your continued defiance is unacceptable." "I'm not being defiant," Lisa said, her voice steady, but Jack could hear the tension underneath. "I'm asking to see the rules you say I'm breaking." "The rules are clear," Patricia Manning interjected. "Vegetable gardens in front yards are prohibited, period." "That's not what the original documents say," Lisa replied. "The board has updated those documents," Kane said dismissively. "You don't get to pick and choose which community standards you'll follow." Jack stepped outside and the dynamic immediately shifted. Kane's aggressive posture faltered slightly when he saw the newcomer, though he tried to maintain his authoritative stance. "And you are?" Kane demanded. "Jack Rodriguez. This is my wife and my property you're discussing." "Then you need to get your wife under control," Kane said, apparently mistaking Jack for someone who could be bullied as easily as he'd been bullying Lisa. "She's in violation of clearly stated community standards." Jack felt something cold settle in his chest. In his military career, he'd learned to recognize different types of threats and respond appropriately. Kane wasn't dangerous in the traditional sense, but he was a predator who used bureaucracy and intimidation instead of weapons. "Which standards specifically?" Jack asked calmly. "Section 4.2 of the updated community guidelines." "Can I see those updated guidelines?" Manning stepped forward with the attitude of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "The board is finalizing the documentation. When it's ready for distribution, you'll receive it. So you're demanding we comply with rules you won't show us?" "We're demanding you comply with common sense," Kane said, his voice rising. "Vegetable gardens don't belong in front yards. They're unsightly and they bring down property values." Jack looked around at the other front yards visible from where they stood. Dying grass, overgrown foundation shrubs, a mailbox held up with duct tape. "More unsightly than those?" "That's not the point," Manning snapped. "The point is following community standards." "Standards that apparently don't apply to everyone equally," Lisa said, pulling out her phone to show photos of Kane's rock garden and Manning's flamingo collection. Kane's face reddened. "How dare you photograph our properties?" "That's harassment." Jack almost smiled at that. Kane was standing in his front yard, demanding they remove their garden while photographing their property for documentation. But somehow Lisa taking pictures from a public sidewalk was harassment. "Let me make sure I understand," Jack said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had once briefed senators and generals. "You're demanding my wife destroy her garden based on rules you won't show us, rules that apparently don't apply to your own properties, and you're threatening legal action against our home if we don't comply." "We're enforcing community standards," Kane said, though he sounded less certain than before. "No," Jack said quietly. "You're running a scam, and you picked the wrong family to target." The temperature of the conversation dropped 10 degrees. Kane tried to bluster back, but something in Jack's demeanor made him step back instead of forward. "Are you threatening us?" Manning demanded. "I'm stating a fact," Jack replied. "You've chosen to harass my family with arbitrary rules and escalating fines. You've made my wife feel unsafe in her own home. You've threatened our property with liens and legal action, all over a vegetable garden that violates no legitimate rule in any document we've ever seen." Jack looked at each of them in turn, the way he'd once studied enemy combatants through a scope. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave our property now. You're going to stop sending threatening letters to my wife. And you're going to produce these mysterious updated standards you keep referencing or admit they don't exist." "Or what?" Kane demanded, though his voice cracked slightly. Jack smiled, and it wasn't a friendly expression. "Or you'll discover that some people don't respond to intimidation the way you're used to." The group left, but not before Kane shouted back that they'd be hearing from the HOA's attorneys. As their cars pulled away, Lisa let out a breath she'd been holding. "That felt good," she said, "but I think we just made this worse." Jack watched the cars disappear around the corner. No, we just changed the rules of engagement. They were counting on us being too intimidated or too isolated to fight back effectively. What happens next? Jack put his arm around his wife, looking at the garden that had started this whole mess. The tomatoes were getting bigger and Katie's sunflowers were starting to show yellow petals. It looked like exactly what it was, a family growing food in their own yard. Next, we stopped playing defense, Jack said. They want to fight over community standards? Let's show them what those standards really look like when they're applied fairly to everyone. That evening, while Katie played in the backyard and Lisa prepared dinner, Jack sat at his computer and began what he'd learned to call operational planning. The HOA board had made a crucial mistake. They'd assumed they were dealing with typical suburban residents who would eventually cave to pressure and pay whatever fines they demanded. Instead, they'd picked a fight with someone who'd spent 2 decades learning how to identify, analyze, and neutralize hostile forces. The fact that this particular hostile force hid behind clipboards and community meetings instead of uniforms and weapons didn't make them any less of a threat to his family's peace and security. Jack opened a new document and began typing. If the Willowbrook Estates HOA wanted to play games with rules and documentation, they were about to discover what real rules and real documentation looked like. This was no longer about a garden. This was about predators who'd been allowed to operate unchecked for too long, and a family that refused to be their next victims. Jack Rodriguez had learned a long time ago that the best defense was thorough preparation. In the Navy, rushing into a situation without proper intelligence got people killed. In suburban warfare, it just got you buried in legal fees and hostile neighbors. So while Robert Kane and his HOA board expected him to either cave in or escalate to shouting matches, Jack did what he'd always done. He gathered information. Monday morning, while Lisa was at work and Katie was at school, Jack began what he privately called reconnaissance. To anyone watching, he was just a friendly new neighbor taking walks around the community, chatting with people working in their yards, maybe stopping to admire someone's flower beds or ask about local restaurants. What he was actually doing was building a comprehensive picture of how the Willowbrook Estates HOA really operated. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly widow who lived 3 streets over, was delighted to have someone to talk to. She'd been fighting the HOA for 8 months over her rose bushes, which apparently violated some new height restriction that no one could show her in writing. They started with a $50 fine, she told Jack, deadheading roses that looked perfectly healthy and well-maintained. Now it's up to $1,200. They're threatening to put a lien on my house over roses that have been here for 15 years. Did you ask to see the rule about height restrictions? Mrs. Henderson laughed bitterly. Asked, begged, demanded. Patricia Manning keeps telling me the standards are being updated, but somehow these updated standards never seem to get finished. Funny how they can fine us for breaking rules they can't produce. Jack made mental notes. Pattern number 1. Arbitrary enforcement of non-existent rules. He asked Mrs. Henderson if she'd noticed which properties seemed to avoid violations. Oh, that's easy, she said. Board members, their friends, and anyone who does business with Robert Kane's construction company. The Petersons hired Kane to redo their driveway last year. Suddenly, their mailbox that was 6 inches too far from the street wasn't a problem anymore. Pattern number 2. Selective enforcement based on personal relationships and financial benefits. At the community center, Jack struck up a conversation with Tom Chen, whose wife had been mentioned by several neighbors as another HOA target. Tom was picking up his mail and seemed eager to vent to someone new. They've fined us 4 times this year, Tom said, showing Jack photos on his phone. Our fence needs approved staining. Our trash cans are visible from the street for 30 minutes too long on pickup day. And our holiday lights were up past the acceptable time frame in January. How long past? 3 days. We had to travel for a family emergency and couldn't take them down until we got back. $50 fine for each day they stayed up. Jack looked at the photos. The Chen family's property was immaculate, better maintained than most of the houses on their street. What about other houses? Do they get fined for the same things? Tom's expression darkened. That's the thing that really gets me. Dale Watson, he's on the board, right? His Christmas lights stayed up until March. No fine. Mrs. Morrison, her trash cans sit by the street all week long because she can't move them herself. No fine. But somehow we're the problem. Pattern number 3. The rules only applied to people the board wanted to target. Jack's most illuminating conversation came from an unexpected source. While walking past the community pool, he noticed a landscaping crew working on the flower beds. One of the workers, a young guy named Alex, was on break and seemed friendly enough. "You live here?" Alex asked, nodding toward the houses surrounding the pool area. "Just moved in." "Nice neighborhood." "Yeah, it's all right. Though the HOA here is pretty intense compared to other places we work." "How so?" Alex looked around to make sure no one was listening. "Most HOAs just want the landscaping to look decent, you know? But these folks, they're constantly changing what they want. We'll install something exactly to their specifications, then 6 months later they'll say it violates some new standard. That must be frustrating for homeowners." "Oh, we don't work for homeowners here. The HOA hired us directly after they started rejecting all the landscaping that residents installed themselves. Funny thing is, the HOA president's construction company gets most of the removal contracts when they declare someone's landscaping non-compliant." Jack felt pieces clicking into place. "So the HOA creates violations, forces removals, and Kane's company profits from the work?" "I didn't say that," Alex said quickly, but his expression confirmed Jack's suspicions. That evening, Jack spread out his findings like he was preparing a mission briefing. Lisa sat across from him, amazed at how much information he'd gathered in just one day. "They're not just power-hungry," Jack explained. "This is a business model. They create violations to generate removal work for Kane's company and design work for Manning's daughter. The fines are just bonus revenue, but that's fraud, isn't it? Hard to prove without documentation. And conveniently, all their new standards exist only in their heads until they need to cite them for violations." Jack had also discovered something else troubling. The Willowbrook Estates HOA had recently changed law firms, hiring Blackstone and Associates, a company that specialized in aggressive debt collection rather than community association law. Their standard contract included a clause that allowed them to add collection fees, legal costs, and administrative charges to any unpaid fines. "Look at this," Jack said, showing Lisa a case study he'd found online. Blackstone helped an HOA in Texas foreclose on 17 homes last year over unpaid fines. Average original violation amount was under $200. Average amount owed after legal fees and collection costs was over $15,000. Lisa stared at the numbers. "They're stealing people's homes. They're using the legal system to transfer property from working families to people who figured out how to game the system." Jack's phone buzzed with a text from Frank, their neighbor. "You need to see this. The Johnsons just put their house up for sale." Frank met them in his driveway 20 minutes later, visibly upset. "The HOA has been hitting the Johnsons with violations for months. Their mailbox color, their lawn maintenance, their parking. Nothing that makes any sense, but the fines kept adding up. How much do they owe? Last I heard, over $3,000. David Johnson works 2 jobs just to make their mortgage payment. They can't afford legal fees to fight it, and they can't afford to keep paying fines for made-up violations." Jack looked at the for sale sign that had appeared in the Johnsons' front yard that afternoon. A young black couple with 2 small children, driven from their home by bureaucratic harassment disguised as community standards. "That's the 3rd family this year," Frank continued. "The Garcias moved out in March after the HOA claimed their fence was 6 inches over the height limit. The Williamses left in January when they couldn't afford the fines for having inappropriate window treatments." "What kind of people are buying these houses?" Lisa asked. Frank's expression was grim. "Robert Kane bought the Garcia house through an LLC. His daughter bought the Williams place. Funny how that works out." Jack felt the familiar cold anger that came when he identified a clear threat to innocent people. This wasn't just about his family's garden anymore. The Willowbrook Estates HOA was systematically driving out residents to benefit a small group of connected individuals who'd turned their neighborhood into a profit center. That night, after Katie was asleep, Jack sat at his computer and began building what he'd learned to call a target package. Not for violence, but for the kind of comprehensive exposure that made corrupt systems collapse under their own weight. He started with public records. Kane's construction company had received over $200,000 in HOA work over the past 2 years, all awarded without competitive bidding. Manning's daughter's landscaping business had similar numbers. The HOA's legal expenses had tripled since switching to Blackstone and Associates, while their actual community improvements had declined. Jack cross-referenced violation notices with board member relationships. painting a clear picture of selective enforcement. Families with no connection to board members received an average of 4 violations per year. Board members and their associates averaged 0 violations despite similar or worse property conditions. Most damning was the pattern of property transfers. Over the past 3 years, 12 families had been forced to sell due to HOA disputes. 6 of those properties had been purchased by LLCs connected to board members or their associates, always at below-market prices. They're not just stealing through fines, Jack told Lisa as he compiled his evidence. They're forcing people out so they can buy their homes cheap. What are we going to do with all this? Jack looked at the files spread across their dining room table. Financial records, violation patterns, property transfers, witness statements. In his military career, this kind of intelligence package would have led to targeted operations against hostile forces. We're going to give Robert Kane and his friends a choice, Jack said. They can stop this voluntarily, or they can explain their business model to some very interested law enforcement agencies. Will that work? Jack smiled, and Lisa recognized the expression from their early dating years when he'd explained why certain classified missions had been successful. Predators like this only operate when they think. No one is watching, and their victims can't fight back effectively. Once they realize they're being watched by someone who knows how to watch, and their victims have backup who knows how to fight, most of them fold pretty quickly. And if they don't fold? Then we find out what happens when people who've been stealing houses through bureaucratic fraud have to answer questions from prosecutors who specialize in racketeering cases. Jack closed his laptop and looked out the window at Lisa's garden, now thriving in the summer heat. Tomorrow he'd make contact with some old colleagues who'd transitioned into law enforcement careers. People who knew how to build cases against organized criminal enterprises, even when those enterprises hid behind homeowners association letterhead. The HOA board thought they were dealing with isolated suburban residents who could be bullied into compliance or driven away through harassment. They were about to discover that some suburban residents had friends in very interesting places, and that their little neighborhood scam was about to get much more attention than they'd ever wanted. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. on a Thursday evening in the community center's main room. Normally, these meetings drew maybe 15 residents, mostly the same faces month after month. But word had spread through the neighborhood that something big was happening, and by 6:45, the room was packed with over 60 people. Robert Kane stood at the front podium, clearly uncomfortable with the crowd size but trying to maintain his usual authoritative demeanor. Patricia Manning sat at the board table shuffling papers nervously. Dale Watson looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Jack Rodriguez entered the room at exactly 7 p.m., carrying a simple black folder and wearing the kind of calm expression that Lisa had learned meant he was absolutely focused. He'd spent the past week making phone calls to old contacts, and the conversations had been very productive. "Let's call this meeting to order," Kane announced, his voice carrying less confidence than usual. "We have standard business to cover tonight." An older gentleman in the back row raised his hand. "Point of order. I think we need to address the elephant in the room before we discuss landscaping contracts." Kane's jaw tightened. "All community concerns will be addressed in their proper time." "When will that be?" asked Mrs. Henderson, standing up despite her 78 years. "Because I've been waiting 8 months for someone to show me the rule that makes my roses illegal." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Kane tried to regain control, but the room's energy had shifted. People who'd been intimidated into silence for months were suddenly finding their voices. Jack stood up slowly and the room quieted. "Mr. Kane, before we continue with normal business, I think the community deserves some answers about how this HOA operates." "Mr. Rodriguez, you're out of order. Community concerns are addressed during the designated time." "Actually," Jack replied, his voice carrying easily through the room, "I think community fraud should be addressed immediately." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Kane's face reddened, but before he could respond, Jack continued. "Over the past weeks, I've been documenting some interesting patterns in HOA enforcement. Would the community like to hear about them?" "Sit down," Manning snapped. "You have no right to make accusations." "I have every right to present facts," Jack replied calmly. He opened his folder and pulled out the first document. "Let's start with violation patterns. Mrs. Henderson, how many violations have you received this year?" 12, she replied clearly. Mr. Chen? 8 violations. Mrs. Martinez? 6, and we've only lived here for 4 months. Jack looked around the room. How many violations have board members received this year? Silence. None. Despite several documented instances where board member properties violate the same standards being enforced against other residents. Kane stood up abruptly. This is harassment, and I won't stand for it. Sit down, Robert, called out Frank from the middle of the room. Let the man talk. Jack pulled out another document. Let's talk about the financial relationships between HOA enforcement actions and board member businesses. Over the past 2 years, Kane Construction has received over $200,000 in HOA contracts, all awarded without competitive bidding. Those contracts were approved by the board, Kane protested. A board that you control, Jack replied. Manning Landscape Design, owned by Patricia Manning's daughter, has received an additional $150,000 in work, primarily cleaning up violations that the HOA created by changing standards without notice. The room erupted in angry voices. Residents who'd been forced to pay for expensive remediation work were realizing they'd been scammed by their own elected representatives. Jack waited for the noise to die down before continuing. But the real issue isn't the money you've stolen through fake violations. It's the homes you've stolen through forced sales. He pulled out a thick stack of papers. 12 families have been forced to sell their homes over the past 3 years due to HOA disputes. 6 of those properties were purchased by LLCs connected to board members, always at below-market prices. The silence was absolute now. Even Kane had stopped trying to interrupt. The Johnsons put their house on the market this week, Jack continued. They're facing $3,000 in fines for violations that don't exist in any written standard. Convenient timing, since Kane Construction just registered a new LLC that specializes in distressed property acquisition. You can't prove any of this, Manning said, her voice shaking. Jack smiled. Actually, I can. Public records are amazing things when you know how to read them. Real estate transactions, business filings, HOA financial records that are required by state law to be available to homeowners. He pulled out another document. But let's talk about the most interesting discovery. Your legal representation contract with Blackstone and Associates includes performance bonuses based on collection amounts. The more fines they collect, the more money they make. And the more homes that go into foreclosure, the bigger their fees. Jack looked directly at Kane. You're not running a homeowners association. You're running a criminal enterprise that steals homes from working families. Kane finally found his voice. You're making serious accusations without evidence. Oh, I have evidence, Jack replied calmly. Documented patterns of selective enforcement. Financial records showing illegal conflicts of interest. Witness statements from contractors who've been pressured to create violations. Email records that your IT department was required to preserve under state records laws. Jack paused and looked around the room. I also have something else. Yesterday I had a very interesting conversation with Detective Sarah Kim from the County District Attorney's Office. She specializes in racketeering cases, and she's very interested in HOA fraud schemes. The blood drained from Kane's face. You contacted the police? I contacted law enforcement, Jack corrected. When citizens discover organized criminal activity in their community, that's what they're supposed to do. Jack pulled out his final document. But I'm not unreasonable. Detective Kim agreed that if this situation could be resolved locally, it might not require a full criminal investigation. The room was so quiet that Katie's bicycle bell could be heard outside as she played in the parking lot. Here's what's going to happen, Jack announced. The current board is going to resign immediately. All fines and legal actions against residents are going to be dropped. All contracts with businesses owned by board members or their families are going to be terminated. And the HOA is going to pay for independent legal review of every violation issued in the past 3 years. You can't demand that, Watson spoke for the first time all evening. Actually, I'm not demanding anything, Jack replied. I'm explaining what's going to happen if you want to avoid criminal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. Kane tried one last bluster. You think you can come in here and threaten us? I'll have you arrested for harassment. Jack's expression didn't change. Robert, I've briefed senators on classified operations. I've testified before Congress about national security matters. I've presented evidence to federal prosecutors that resulted in convictions for much smarter criminals than you. He gestured toward the packed room. These people trusted you to serve their community, and you turned their neighborhood into your personal ATM. That ends tonight. Frank stood up. I move that the current board resign immediately. Seconded, called out Mrs. Henderson. All in favor? Frank asked. Nearly every hand in the room went up. The vote wasn't legally binding, but the message was clear. Kane looked around the room at faces that had once shown him deference and now showed only contempt. Manning was already gathering her papers, clearly ready to leave. Watson sat frozen, probably calculating how much legal trouble he was facing. Fine, Kane said finally. You want to run this place? Good luck dealing with the county regulations and state compliance requirements. See how you like it when your precious gardens don't meet environmental standards. Actually, Jack said quietly, I already checked those standards. Lisa's garden exceeds environmental compliance requirements for water conservation and sustainable landscaping. But thank you for admitting that you've been enforcing fake rules. Kane stormed out, followed by Manning and Watson. The room erupted in applause and excited chatter as residents realized they'd just witnessed something extraordinary. Mrs. Henderson made her way over to Jack and Lisa. I don't know how to thank you, she said, tears in her eyes. I thought I was going to lose my house over rose bushes that my husband planted before he died. You shouldn't have to fight this alone, Jack replied. That's what community really means. Over the following weeks, the cleanup was systematic and thorough. The new board, elected in an emergency meeting, hired an independent attorney to review every action taken by the previous administration. Illegal fines were refunded. Forced contracts were canceled. Families who'd been driven from their homes received documentation that helped them pursue civil remedies. Robert Kane's construction company faced multiple lawsuits and eventually filed for bankruptcy. Patricia Manning quietly resigned from her school district position when the investigation revealed she'd been using district resources for HOA business. Dale Watson cooperated with investigators and received immunity in exchange for his testimony. Detective Kim's investigation expanded beyond Willowbrook Estates when they discovered Kane's group had been consulting with HOA boards in other communities, spreading their fraudulent model. The case eventually resulted in state legislation strengthening oversight of homeowners associations and protecting residents from predatory enforcement practices. 6 months later, Jack stood in his front yard watching Lisa harvest tomatoes while Katie helped by holding the basket. The garden was thriving, and so was the neighborhood. Property values had actually increased once residents stopped living in fear of arbitrary harassment. The local newspaper had run a feature story about the HOA uprising that praised community, activism, and transparent governance. Jack had declined to be interviewed, preferring to let the focus stay on the residents who'd found their voices and reclaimed their neighborhood. Daddy, why did those mean people want to take away Mommy's garden? Katie asked one evening while they worked together, building her long-promised treehouse. Jack thought about how to explain adult corruption to a 7-year-old. Sometimes people forget that being in charge means helping others, not helping themselves. But when good people work together, they can fix those problems. Like you and Mommy did, like our whole neighborhood did, Jack corrected. We just helped them realize they had the power to fix things themselves. That evening, as Jack tucked Katie into bed, she asked one more question. Are the mean people going to come back? Jack smiled and kissed her forehead. No, sweetheart. They're never coming back. And if anyone ever tries to be mean to our family again, they'll discover that some families have ways of taking care of themselves. Outside, Lisa's garden grew in neat, beautiful rows under the summer stars, finally safe to flourish in the neighborhood that had learned to protect what truly mattered.